The morning Clara Voss drove the first stake into the Montana earth, the sky was the color of hammered copper, and the air smelled of cut grass and coming cold. It was the 14th of August, 1888. Summer had not yet surrendered, but Clara knew better than to trust it. She had lived through enough Montana seasons to understand that the land made no promises. It simply endured and punished those who forgot that endurance was the only contract it offered. She was 34 years old. She had the hands of a woman, 10 years older, cracked at the knuckles, calloused across the palm, stained permanently at the fingertips, with the dark pigment of soil that no amount of washing ever entirely removed. She was not a large woman, but she was a dense one built from the inside out by years of work that had no witness and required none. Her hair was the color of winter wheat, pulled back and pinned with the practical severity of someone who had stopped thinking about such things a long time ago. She drove the second stake 20 feet from the first, then a third, then a fourth, each one connected by a length of twine that stretched across the yard in a straight line from the northeast corner of the root cellar beneath her cabin to the foundation wall of the barn that stood 100 feet away. 100 feet. She had measured it 4 times. She measured it again now, pacing it slowly, counting under her breath, her boots leaving shallow impressions in the dry August grass. 100 feet. In August, it was a minor inconvenience. A brisk walk across a sun-warmed yard. In January, it had nearly killed her. She picked up her shovel and began to dig. She had been digging for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the small, quick footsteps behind her. She did not turn around. She knew those footsteps the way she knew the sound of the wind changing direction or the particular creak of the cabin's north wall when the temperature dropped below zero. She knew them the way she knew her own heartbeat. "Mama, Callum, I drew something." She drove the shovel into the earth and turned. Her son was 6 years old and serious in the way that some children are serious, not unhappily, but essentially as though he had arrived in the world already acquainted with its weight and had decided to carry his share without complaint. He had his father's eyes, which were gray and precise, the eyes of a man who looked at things carefully before he said anything about them. He was holding a piece of brown wrapping paper in both hands, offering it to her with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence. Clara took it. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. The drawing was made in the careful, concentrated lines of a child who had not yet learned to doubt his own hand. It showed 2 buildings, one small and rectangular, one larger, connected by a long underground passage. The passage was drawn in cross-section the way an engineer might draw it, showing the interior space and the earth above it. Along the sides of the passage, Callum had drawn small marks that might have been stones. At each end, he had drawn a door. Clara's hands were not entirely steady. She had shown Callum nothing. She had told him nothing. The notebook she had been working from, Henrik's notebook, with its dense German script and its careful engineering diagrams, was kept in the wooden chest beneath her bed, locked with a small iron key she wore on a cord around her neck. Callum could not read German. Callum could not read much of anything yet. He was 6 years old, and he had drawn from whatever country exists between sleep and waking, between memory and imagination, the precise shape of what his dead father had designed and his living mother had decided to build. "I just drew what felt right, Mama," he said. She folded the paper carefully and put it in the pocket of her apron. She looked at her son for a moment, at his serious gray eyes, at the small, capable hands that still held the slight curve of the paper he had just given her, and she felt something move through her chest that had no name she could find in either English or German. It was not grief, though it lived close to grief. It was not comfort, though it offered something adjacent to comfort. It was the sensation of a door opening in a room she had not known existed. "Go get your wagon," she said, "the small one. I'm going to need help moving stones." He went without another word, which was characteristic. Callum Voss was a child who understood instructions and followed them. She watched him cross the yard toward the barn, small and upright in the morning light, and then she picked up her shovel and drove it back into the earth. She had, as she thought of it later, no choice. That was not entirely accurate, but it was the way the decision felt from the inside, not like a choice, but like a recognition. Something she had already known and was only now admitting to herself. To understand what Claire was building and why you have to understand what the winter of 1887 had taken from her. Not just Henrik. The winter had been taking things from Clara Voss for months before it took her husband, and it had kept taking long after he was gone. Henrik Voss had died in March of 1887. A rockfall in the East Mine, 2 miles from their homestead on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sky was beginning to show the first tentative suggestions of spring, and Clara had allowed herself to believe the worst was over. The worst was not over. 3 men had died in that collapse. Henrik had been one of them, and by the time they brought him out, there was nothing for Clara to do except arrange his burial in the frozen ground and begin the slow, practical work of understanding what his absence meant for her and for the 6-year-old boy who had inherited his father's eyes and his father's silences. What it meant practically was this 30 acres of marginal land, a cabin that was sturdy but small, a barn that was larger than the cabin but colder, and a collection of animals that represented the entirety of their material future. One milk cow named Nell, whose placid temperament and reliable production had made her the most important living thing on the property. 2 goats with names Clara had long since stopped using, whose milk supplemented Nell's, and whose personalities she had come to regard with a mixture of affection and exhausted irritation. 6 chickens that were less livestock than they were, a small clucking argument against despair. 6 warm-blooded creatures that turned grain into protein and made a sound in the morning that reminded Clara obscurely that the world was still engaged in the ordinary business of being alive. These animals were not in any sentimental sense pets. They were partners. They were the margin between surviving and not surviving, and Clara understood this with the cold clarity that comes from having been very close to the second option. The winter of 1887 to 1888 had been her first alone. It had been, by the standards of Granite County, a moderately severe winter, not the worst anyone could remember, but sufficient. Sufficient to teach Clara things she had not known she needed to learn. The lesson arrived on the 22nd of January. A blizzard descended in the early afternoon with the kind of speed that the Montana plains reserve for their most serious intentions. Within 2 hours, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees, and the snow was no longer falling, but flying horizontal, driven a white curtain drawn across the world with no concern for what it obscured. The distance from the cabin to the barn, 100 feet of packed earth yard that she had walked 1,000 times, became something else entirely. It became a passage through a country where visibility ended at arm's length, and the cold was not a condition but a presence, a physical force that sought exposed skin the way water seeks low ground. She had rigged a rope between the 2 buildings before the first snow of the season, following the advice of an older neighbor who had survived on these plains long enough to know what killed people. She used it now, pulling herself hand over hand through the white darkness, her eyes closed against the stinging needles of ice, her breath a useless gasp against the wind that ripped it away before she could draw the next one. The journey took 11 minutes. She knew because she counted. Counting was the only thing she could do to keep the panic from becoming something she could not manage. Nell had a lung fever by the time Clara reached her. The cow's breathing was labored and wet, steaming in the lantern light in great ragged clouds that condensed on the barn walls and froze there. Clara had spent the next 3 weeks sleeping in the barn on a pile of straw, waking every 2 hours to check the cow's breathing, to offer warm mashes she prepared on the small camp stove she had dragged from the cabin, to hold a lantern close to the animal's side and listen with the focused, frightened attention of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Nell survived. The recovery was slow and incomplete. The cow would never produce quite as much milk as she had before that January, a deficit that had real consequences for the following year. But she was alive. Clara had kept her alive through 6 weeks of a Montana winter, making that 100-foot crossing multiple times a day, each time a negotiation with conditions that did not negotiate. By the time spring came, something had settled into Clara's bones that was colder and more permanent than the season itself. It was not fear exactly. Fear implies uncertainty about the outcome. What Clara felt was the opposite of uncertainty. She was absolutely certain that the arrangement she was living under, the cabin and the barn separated by 100 feet of open ground, would eventually kill one of them. Nell, or one of the goats, or the chickens, or Callum, or herself. The variables were only the timing and the victim. The outcome without intervention was fixed. She had spent the summer of 1888 thinking about intervention. The evening that changed everything had come in late July, 3 weeks before she drove the first stake into the ground. Callum was asleep. The cabin was warm in the particular way of Montana summer evenings, a warmth that carried in it no promise of what would come, but was pleasant while it lasted. Clara had opened the wooden chest at the foot of the bed for the first time in months. The chest smelled of pine and iron filings and ink and something else, something she could not name and did not try to, because naming it would have required her to acknowledge what it was, and she was not ready for that. She lifted out the stack of leather-bound notebooks and set them on the table. Henrik's handwriting covered every page in the small, precise script of someone who had thought carefully about what he was writing and saw no reason to waste paper on uncertainty. Henrik Voss had not been, as the town of Copperhead Creek understood him, merely a miner who was good with dynamite. He had been something more specific and more unusual than that, a man with a formal education in geological engineering from a technical school in Saxony who had come to America in 1882 with a wife, a trunk of books, and a set of ideas about the relationship between underground spaces and thermal stability that had no practical application in any mine he had ever worked in, but that he had continued developing in his private notebooks with the patient persistence of someone who believed that a correct idea would eventually find its moment. Clara had known this about him. She had not entirely understood it while he was alive, had filed it under the general category of Henrik's complicated inner world, and returned to the more immediate concerns of running a homestead. Now she read his notebooks with an attention she had not given them before, working through the German, slowly pausing over the diagrams, tracing the lines of his drawings with her fingertip as though proximity might transfer comprehension. What she found in the fifth notebook was the sketch. It was drawn in two parts. The upper portion showed a cabin and a barn seen from the side with a long, low mound of earth between them. The lower portion showed the same structures in cross-section, revealing the interior of the mound, a stone-lined passage, 5 feet high, connecting the root cellar of the cabin to the foundation of the barn. Along the walls of the passage, Henrik had drawn arrows indicating airflow. At intervals, he had noted temperatures in the neat numerical shorthand of an engineer outside -30, surface ground -15, 3 feet below surface 8 degrees, 6 feet below surface 52 degrees. In the margin beside the sketch, in the smaller handwriting he used for notes, he considered important but did not wish to emphasize, he had written, Die Erde vergisst den Sommer nicht. The earth does not forget the summer. Clara read the phrase 3 times. Then she sat with it in the quiet of the cabin, with the warm summer night pressing against the windows, and Callum breathing in his sleep on the other side of the room, and she let the idea take the shape it wanted to take in her mind. The earth does not forget the summer. Below the frost line, below the level at which the surface cold could reach the ground, maintained a temperature that was a kind of average, a mean between the extremes. Not warm, but not killing. In that part of Montana, the deep earth held steady at somewhere between 45 and 55 degrees year after year, regardless of what the sky was doing. It was cold, but it was a cold that lived within the range of the survivable. It was cold that an animal could endure, or a person without requiring the constant intervention of fire. Henrik had understood this from his work in the mines. He had understood that the deep rock was not cold in the way that the winter air was cold. It was simply neutral, indifferent, stable, a place where the killing extremes of surface weather could not reach. And he had looked at the 100 feet of open ground between his cabin and his barn, and he had thought, what if that distance did not have to be traversed? What if the two buildings could be connected by a passage that ran through the only medium that could guarantee the journey would not be fatal? What if you could borrow the Earth's memory of summer? Clara looked at the sketch for a long time. Then she looked at the single page in the notebook that was folded over its edge, marked in Henrik's handwriting, with 4 words, only when it gets bad enough. She did not open it, not that night. She was not sure why some instinct told her that the information on that page belonged to a later moment, that to read it now would be to use a resource before she understood what it was for. She tucked the notebook back into the chest. She laid down on the bed in her clothes and looked at the ceiling until the sky outside began to lighten. In the morning, she began to plan. The first problem was the scope of the work. What Henrik had sketched was not a shallow trench or a simple covered walkway. It was a genuine underground structure, a passage that would need to descend at least 6 feet below the surface to reach stable thermal ground, that would need to be stone-lined for structural integrity, roofed with timber and covered with sufficient earth to provide the insulation that would make the temperature difference meaningful. It was in the most straightforward assessment, more work than one woman and a 6-year-old could reasonably accomplish before winter. Clara was not interested in reasonable. She was interested in alive. She began with the surface marking, stakes and twine, the line running from the root cellar of the cabin to the foundation wall of the barn, the straightest possible course across the 100 feet of yard. She had been at this work for 20 minutes when Callum appeared with his drawing, and the drawing had unsettled something in her that she had not yet named, but that made the work feel suddenly less like a calculation and more like a duty. The ground fought her from the first shovelful. The August earth of Montana was not the soft cooperative soil of agricultural country. It was a layered argument, hard-packed clay at the surface studded at irregular intervals with rocks that ranged from the size of a fist to the size of a skull, transitioning below that to a denser matrix of clay and smaller stones that resisted the shovel with a consistency that felt almost personal. Every foot of depth was a negotiation, every rock a separate problem. By the end of the first day, she had cleared 18 feet of trench, 3 feet deep, and her hands had told her in the most direct possible language that they were not accustomed to this kind of conversation. She wrapped them at night and unwrapped them in the morning and picked up the shovel again. Callum pulled stones away in his small wagon, the one Henrik had built for him the previous spring from the scraps of a broken-down supply wagon, 4 planks, 2 axles wheels, cut from a section of log. It was not an elegant piece of engineering, but it was functional, and watching Callum haul load after load of Montana rock across the yard, small and methodical, and entirely uncomplaining, Clara felt something she had no word for either. Henrik had built the wagon. The wagon was now helping to build the thing Henrik had designed. There was a circularity to this that she did not examine too closely because she was afraid that examining it would undo her. By the end of the first week, the trench was 30 feet long and 4 feet deep. Her neighbors had noticed. Garrett Dunmore was the first to stop. He was the owner of the grain mill at the north edge of Copperhead Creek, a man of 45 with a broad face and the cheerful certainty of someone who had never had a plan fail badly enough to teach him humility. He pulled his wagon to a stop at the edge of her property and looked at the trench with the expression of a man seeing something he had to work to categorize. "Root cellar extension, Mrs. Voss," he called out. His voice was friendly. The friendliness was not unkind. "Connecting it to the barn," she said, not looking up. A pause. "Connecting it to the barn. That's right. For what purpose? To walk and for the air." The silence that followed had a particular texture, the texture of a man reformulating his understanding of a situation he thought he had already understood. Clara drove her shovel into the earth and leveraged out a large pale rock and set it aside for Callum's wagon. "A man could build a whole cabin," Garrett said finally, "in the time it'll take you to dig that ditch. A rope line is all you need for the snow, Mrs. Voss. That's what everyone uses." She did not respond. He waited a moment longer, then clicked his tongue at his horses and drove on. The story traveled as stories do in small territories where the population is sparse and the winters are long, and other people's peculiarities are a form of entertainment. Within a week, Copperhead Creek had established a loose consensus. Clara Voss, the German widow, had gone strange with grief. It was understandable the consensus held. She had lost her husband. She had been alone through a hard winter. Some people went strange in the ways you could see coming. Some went strange in ways you couldn't. The widow's trench was the latter kind. They called it Clara's folly. She heard it for the first time from Prudence Dunmore, Garrett's wife, who made the mistake of saying it within earshot while Clara was at the mercantile in town. Prudence was not cruel by nature. She was simply a woman who repeated what she heard without much consideration for where the words landed. Clara bought her flour and her salt and her lamp oil and went home and dug another 8 feet. What none of them knew, what she had not told anyone, and did not intend to tell anyone yet, was that the project was not grief. It was its opposite. It was the most deliberate, forward-looking thing she had done since Henrik died. It was the answer to a question the previous winter had asked her very directly in the language of a cow with lung fever and an 11-minute crawl through horizontal snow. The question was, how do you keep the things that are alive from dying? And the answer, as best she could determine from the notebooks of a man who was no longer alive to explain them, was you change the terms of the problem. The terms of the problem, as Copperhead Creek understood them, were these: winter was a siege, and the job of a homesteader was to withstand it. You built your cabin thick and your woodpile tall and your root cellar deep, and you endured until the spring came back and released you. This was the received wisdom. It had worked for some people and failed for others, and the failures were understood as a matter of preparation or luck or character, not as a failure of the model itself. Henrik had believed the model was wrong. Clara was beginning to believe it too. She was 40 feet into the trench on a Tuesday afternoon in late August when she heard the approach of a horse that was not moving at the pace of a man passing by on his way somewhere else. This was a horse being ridden slowly, deliberately, by someone who had come to a specific destination. She knew before she looked up who it would be. Harlan Stroud was 58 years old, and he had been the most successful rancher in Granite County for 20 years. He had come to Montana from Illinois in 1865 with $200 and a complete absence of doubt, and he had built from those materials a cattle operation that now ran 8,000 head across 120,000 acres of rangeland. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders and chest, with a face that the weather had worked on extensively, and that bore as a result an expression of permanent and considered judgment. He believed in things that worked. He had built his life from things that worked, and he did not have patience for things that didn't. He had lost his son Daniel the previous winter. Daniel had been 19 years old, strong and capable, a young man who had grown up on that rangeland and knew its dangers and respected them. He had gone out in a February blizzard to reach the cattle barn a distance from the main house of 150 feet, and he had not come back. They found him the next morning, 40 feet from the barn door, frozen. The distance had been the problem. 150 feet through a blizzard at 40 below had been the distance between his life and its ending. Harlan Stroud had built the best cattle barn in Granite County. He had used the best timber and the tightest joinery, and he had banked the walls with hay bales for insulation, and he had done everything that the received wisdom said to do. And the distance between his house and that barn had killed his son. He had not discussed this with anyone. He did not discuss things. But the knowledge of it had settled into him like a stone dropped into deep water, and it had been there ever since, invisible on the surface, present in everything. He rode to the edge of her trench and looked down at her. He did not dismount. "Mistress Voss," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who was accustomed to speaking last. She looked up at him. The afternoon light was behind him, and he was a dark shape against a copper sky, large and formal on his horse, like a figure in a painting meant to illustrate the concept of authority. "Mr. Stroud, I'll come directly to it," he said. "You are engaged in a piece of folly that the community is talking about and that concerns me, and it should concern you. You are spending the last good weeks of summer on a hole in the ground when you should be stacking wood and laying in meat and doing the 10 dozen other things that the season requires. A widow and her boy cannot afford this kind of distraction." Clara straightened up. She was standing in a trench 4 feet deep, which meant that she was looking up at him, which was not the position she would have chosen for this conversation. She leaned on her shovel and looked at him steadily. "I have enough wood, Mr. Stroud," she said. "This is also winter work." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "This is a hole in the ground. It will fill with snow. It will collapse. It will draw damp and sickness into your home. A house is meant to stand in the sun, not burrow like a badger." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped, slightly losing some of its proclamatory quality and acquiring something more complicated. "I am advising you for the sake of your boy to abandon this project. Fill it in. Spend the time on proven preparations." Clara looked away from him. She looked down at the stone wall she had been building along the east side of the trench, flat rocks selected and placed with care, fitted together without mortar, in the dry stack method that required judgment rather than material, each stone chosen for its flat faces and its willingness to sit flush against its neighbors. She ran her palm along the wall. The stone was cool, not cold cool, the particular patient coolness of the earth at depth where the summer had been stored and held against the season's forgetting. She looked back up at Stroud. "A sink can also be a source, Mr. Stroud," she said. He stared at her. The words had the quality of something taken from a context he didn't have access to, and his face showed the particular frustration of a man who is accustomed to understanding things and has just encountered something he doesn't. "You are making a mistake," he said. "That will cost you." He turned his horse and rode away. Clara watched him go. She stood in her trench with the shovel in her hands and watched the large certain figure of Harlan Stroud ride back toward the main road, and she felt in her chest a complicated mixture of things, not anger, not quite, but something in anger's family, some heated awareness of the distance between what she knew and what she could explain. The knowledge was in Henrik's notebooks. The notebooks were in German. She was standing in a hole in the ground in Montana, and the most powerful man in the county had just informed her she was digging her grave. She went back to her cabin that evening, and as she did every evening, opened Henrik's notebook to the place she had last been reading. She was working through it systematically in order making notes in English on a separate piece of paper, where she set down the things she understood and the things she needed to think about further. She turned to page 47. She stopped. She had not reached page 47 before. She had been working through the notebook in sequence, and she was only now arriving here, and what she found on page 47 was a sentence she recognized. A sentence she had spoken 2 hours ago to Harlan Stroud. A sink can also be a source. Henrik had written it in English, one of the occasional English phrases scattered through the German text phrases he had encountered in his reading and found useful. It was followed by 3 lines of German that she translated slowly, her pencil moving along beneath the words, "The fireplace draws warmth upward and outward. The draft it creates pulls cold air in from every gap in the walls. The man who believes he is warming his house is warming the sky. This is not a trivial error. This is the error that kills people." Clara set the notebook down on the table. She sat with her hands flat against the wood and looked at the opposite wall. She had said a dead man's words to a living man without knowing they were not her own. She had reached in a moment of confrontation into some part of herself she had not known was there, and had pulled out Henrik. The sentence had come to her without thought, without retrieval. It had simply appeared as though it had always been there, as though the year of solitude and notebooks and cold and survival had done something to her that she had not noticed happening. She picked up the notebook. She did not read further that night. Instead, she turned to the folded page, the one with Henrik's note on its edge, only when it gets bad enough. She looked at it for a long time. She left it folded, but her fingers rested on it longer than they had before. 3 days later, on a morning in early September, a figure appeared at the edge of her property that she did not recognize. He was old, she put him at 70 or thereabouts, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had accumulated a history of hard use and had opinions about how much more it was willing to absorb. He wore the clothes of a working man, plain and worn, and he carried nothing. He walked to the edge of her trench and stood there looking down into it for a long time without speaking. She waited. She had learned in the years since Henrik died that there were people who needed silence before they could say what they had come to say. "Pennsylvania bituminous seam," the old man said finally, 40 feet down, 52 degrees, year-round. He paused. "Never changes." His name, she learned later, was Ezra Whitlock. He had come to Montana from the coal fields of western Pennsylvania 15 years earlier, carrying in his body the particular knowledge that a man accumulates from 3 decades of working underground knowledge about rock and air and temperature and moisture, the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and the lungs rather than the mind. He had settled on a small piece of land at the far edge of the valley beyond the last neighbor and had been living there quietly for years, growing a garden and staying out of other people's business, with the commitment of someone who had made a considered decision on the matter. He had not come to help. He had come, she thought, because he recognized something, because he had seen the trench and the stone-lined walls and the careful angle of the entrance, and had understood, perhaps for the first time in years, that someone nearby was asking the same question he had spent 30 years learning the answer to. He did not stay long. Before he left, he folded a small piece of paper and tucked it into the split of a fence post near the entrance to her property. She found it after he was gone. On it, in a handwriting that had the compressed precision of someone accustomed to writing in cramped conditions, he had written 6 feet minimum below frost line. Drainage every 15 feet. Don't forget the moisture. Clara read it 3 times. She understood the first 2 lines completely. The 3rd line she noted without fully understanding and tucked the paper into her apron pocket and went back to her shovel. She would understand the 3rd line later. She would understand it at a moment when the understanding would be both necessary and very nearly too late. The work deepened through September. The trench reached 5 feet, then 6. The stone walls rose to match the depth each course laid, with the careful attention of someone who had no margin for structural failure. Callum continued his work with the wagon ferrying stones from the growing pile at the edge of the pasture stones that Clara and Henrik had cleared from that ground in the first 2 years of the homestead, stones that had been an obstacle and were now a resource. Everything Henrik had done on this land was available to her. Everything he had built, every stone he had moved, every piece of lumber he had cut and stacked, all of it was still here, still useful, still capable of serving a purpose, even in his absence. This thought came to her one evening as she was lying in the bottom of the trench, looking up at the rectangle of September sky above her back flat against the cool earth, her arms tired past the point of pain into something more like numbness. It was not a comforting thought exactly, but it was a true one, and in the absence of comfort, truth was the thing that kept her getting up in the morning. By the end of September, the trench was 70 feet long, 6 feet deep, and stone-lined on both walls and the floor. She had begun laying the roof timbers, heavy beams salvaged from a collapsed shed on the back of the property beams, that Henrik had kept because he kept everything that might be useful, and because his sense of potential usefulness extended far beyond the horizon of the immediately practical. On top of the timbers, she laid hides waterproofed with rendered fat, creating a membrane against moisture. On top of the hides, she began shovelful by shovelful to return the earth. The days grew short, the nights grew cold. The first hard frost came in early October, silvering the grass and hardening the ground each morning, and Clara worked faster, her urgency calibrated now. Not against the abstract future, but against the specific, visible approach of the thing she was preparing for. Callum worked beside her. He was still 6 years old, still small, still equipped with the limited physical resources of a child. But he understood the urgency without being told understood it, the way children understand the things that are not explained to them, but are legible in the behavior of the adults they depend on. He pulled his wagon, he handed up stones, he held the end of the measuring line. He did not complain, and he did not ask questions that were not useful. One afternoon, while Clara was positioning a roof beam with the iron bar Henrik had used for levering rock in the mine, Callum appeared at the edge of the trench with a cup of water and a piece of dried apple. He lowered them down to her on a length of twine without being asked. She looked up at him, at his small, serious face against the pale October sky, and she thought, this is what Henrik meant. This is what he was designing when he drew that sketch in his notebook. Not a structure, a future. A place where this boy could grow up without the winter as his primary opponent. She drank the water, she ate the apple, she picked up the iron bar and kept working. By the first week of November, the tunnel was complete, or nearly complete. There were details still to finish, gaps in the stonework to be chinked, a second door to be hung at the barn end. But the passage was traversable. On the evening of its completion, Clara took a lantern and descended through the root cellar into the mouth of the tunnel and walked its full length for the first time. The silence was absolute. The lantern light moved against the stone walls in patterns that had a quality of antiquity, as though she were walking through something that had existed for centuries rather than weeks. The air was cool and still and carried the smell of damp earth and distant hay. It was not warm, but it was not the winter. It occupied a territory between the extremes, the Earth's own temperature, Henrik's 52 degrees patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to whatever the sky was doing above it. She emerged in the barn to the sound of Nell shifting in her stall. The cow turned her head and regarded Clara with the calm, lateral gaze of a creature that had decided to reserve judgment. The air in the barn was cold but not dangerous. The water in the trough had a skim of ice but was still liquid beneath. The goats were huddled together in the corner with the pragmatic body heat sharing of animals who understand thermodynamics without having a name for it. Clara stood in the barn with the lantern in her hand and listened to the sound of her animals breathing. Then she went back through the tunnel to the cabin, and she sat at the table, and she opened Henrik's notebook. She had been working through it in sequence, and she had arrived tonight at the page she had been avoiding. The folded page. The one with the 4 words on its edge, only when it gets bad enough. She opened it. Henrik's handwriting was smaller here, more compressed, as though he had been writing quickly or writing from some place of urgency. She worked through the Germans slowly, and as she read, the warmth she had felt in the tunnel began to cool. He had built a tunnel, not in Montana, in Saxony. In the winter of 1879, before he came to America, he had constructed a passage connecting his father's farmhouse to the animal barn using the same principle, the same thermal logic, the same stone-lined design. He had been proud of it. He had believed in it completely. It had failed. The failure had a specific cause: moisture. The warm, wet air produced by the breathing of the animals, the same biological warmth that was the system's greatest asset, had a second effect that he had not accounted for. In a sealed passage with insufficient drainage, the moisture accumulated on the stone walls. In temperatures that dipped below freezing at the entrance points, that moisture froze. The ice built up gradually, first as a skim on the surface of the stone, then as a thickening layer, then as a blockage. The passage that was meant to carry tempered air became instead a conduit for the worst of both worlds. The moisture of the barn trapped against the cold of the surface, compressing and freezing until the airflow was restricted and the temperature in the passage began to drop rather than stabilize. The tunnel in its final state had been colder than the barn. It had been colder than the outside air. It had been a trap. He had written it, "I should have included drainage channels. I should have accounted for the moisture. I did not because I was so certain of the principle that I failed to think carefully about the practice." This is an engineer's error of the worst kind, not ignorance but confidence. Clara set the notebook down. She looked at the tunnel door in her root cellar floor, the door she had just walked through twice, the tunnel she had spent 3 months building, the structure that was meant to save them. Outside, the November wind moved through the eaves with a sound that was not quite a voice but was not a voice either. She reached into her apron pocket and found Ezra Whitlock's note. She unfolded it and read it again. 6 feet minimum below frost line. Drainage every 15 feet. Don't forget the moisture. He had known. He had come and looked at her trench, and he had known the problem that was waiting in it, and he had written it on a piece of paper and left it in a fence post, and she had read it and noted it and not understood it, and now she understood it, and the first snow of the season was 3 days away. She looked at the tunnel door. She looked at Callum sleeping on his bed across the room. She picked up the shovel. She did not sleep that night. There was no decision to make, which was the only reason she was able to move at all. When the options reduce themselves to one, the mind stops negotiating and the body begins. Clara put on her heaviest coat, her gloves, her boots. She lit a second lantern and set it at the entrance to the tunnel. She took the iron bar and the narrower of her 2 shovels, the one Henrik had used for detail work in the mine, the blade no wider than a man's hand, and she descended into the earth. The tunnel was exactly as she had left it an hour before. Cool, still. The lantern light moved slowly across the stone walls. She knelt at the base of the nearest wall and pressed her palm flat against the surface of the stone. It was damp, not wet, not dripping, but damp in the way that stone gets damp when warm, moist air meets a cooler surface, and the water in the air decides to stop being air and become something else. She moved her palm along the wall 3 feet, 6 feet, to the first junction point where the tunnel passed beneath the deepest section of earth coverage. Here the stone was cooler. Here the dampness was more pronounced. She understood now, with the complete understanding that comes from reading a mistake in someone else's handwriting and recognizing it in the stone beneath your own hand, exactly what Henrik had encountered in Saxony 9 years before. The principle was sound. The execution had a flaw. The flaw was not fatal yet, but it would become fatal, and it would become fatal at the worst possible moment in the deep cold of January, when the damp on the stone walls would freeze, and the ice would build, and the passage would become not a corridor of tempered air, but a column of trapped cold, and everything she had built would work against her. She began to dig. The drainage channels needed to run along the base of both walls. The full length of the tunnel angled slightly toward the barn end, where she would cut a small outlet through the foundation into the earth below the frost line. The work was different from the excavating she had done in August and September. This was precision work, close work, the kind that required feeling as much as seeing. She could not swing the shovel freely in the confined space. She worked with the iron bar to loosen the packed earth at the base of each wall, then scooped it out with the narrow blade, shaping the channel with her hands where the tool was too blunt, pressing the earth into the form she needed. Reading the angle with her body, the way Henrik had taught her to read the slope of a drainage ditch, not with instruments, but with the water you imagine flowing through it. She worked for 2 hours before she came back up for water, and to check on Callum. He was still sleeping, his breathing steady, and even one hand curled near his face in the way he had slept since infancy. She stood over him for a moment and felt the full weight of the night pressing down on her. Not the physical weight of the work, which was considerable, but the other weight, the weight of everything that depended on the next 3 days going correctly. She went back down. The second shift lasted 3 hours. By the time she came up again, the eastern wall had its channel, and she had begun the western. Her hands were no longer cold. They had passed through cold into a kind of informed numbness that was not painful, but that she knew from experience she needed to manage carefully. She warmed them at the stove, flexed and bent the fingers until the sensation returned, drank a cup of water, and went back. Callum woke at his usual hour before full light. He dressed himself, which he had been doing since he was 4, and came to the root cellar door and looked down. She was at the far end of the tunnel, working by lantern light, her back to him. "Mama." "Callum, are you fixing something?" "Yes." "Do you need the wagon?" She thought about it. "Not yet. Make yourself breakfast. I'll be up soon." She heard him move to the stove, heard the small, competent sounds of a child who had learned to feed himself because there were mornings when his mother was not available to do it for him. The sounds were ordinary and specific, and she held onto them while she worked the scrape of the pot. The small percussion of the spoon, the pause while he waited for the oatmeal to warm. These sounds were why she was in this tunnel at 5 in the morning with numb hands and a narrow shovel. She did not need to remind herself of this, but she held on to it anyway, the way you hold on to a rope. By mid-morning of the first day, both drainage channels were cut, and she had begun the work of lining them with flat stones, small ones carefully chosen laid in a single course along the base of each channel to prevent the earth from slumping back into the space she had created. This was slow work. Each stone had to be assessed flat enough, stable enough, small enough to be placed precisely in the narrow channel. Callum brought her stones from the pile outside, selecting them with a seriousness that suggested he understood at least partially what he was looking for. She had not explained the criteria. He had observed her rejecting and accepting stones and had derived the standard from the pattern. He was 6 years old, and he was already in some fundamental way his father's son. The wind picked up in the afternoon. She could hear it above her, muffled by the earth, reduced to a low, persistent pressure against the tunnel's ceiling, but present. She checked the temperature in the tunnel by feel, the way she had learned to check it over the past months. It was cooler than it had been that morning, not by much, but the direction of change was clear. She worked faster. The second night was harder than the first. The fatigue was no longer the clean, muscular fatigue of physical work well begun. It was the compound fatigue of work continued past the point at which the body had expected to stop. Her shoulders had developed a specific articulated ache that lived in the joint and radiated down the arm when she lifted the iron bar. Her lower back had formed its own opinion about the matter and was expressing it continuously. She ignored both. Ignoring was a skill like any other. She had been developing it for a year. At some point in the second night, she could not have said when, because she had stopped tracking time and was tracking only progress. She sat down on the floor of the tunnel with her back against the stone wall and her legs extended and her hands flat on the earth beside her, and she allowed herself to stop moving. The lantern was burning low. She would need to refill it before much longer. The tunnel was around her, the stone walls and the low ceiling, and the particular stillness of underground space. A stillness that had nothing passive in it, that was not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of something immense and patient, that had been here long before she arrived and would be here long after she left. She thought about Henrik in the Saxony winter. She thought about him making the same mistake in a different country, in a different decade, writing about it afterward, with the careful honesty of an engineer who believed that the purpose of failure was to become information. He had not given up. He had written it down. He had folded the page over and written on the outside, "Only when it gets bad enough." He had saved the failure for her, not intentionally. He could not have known she would need it. But he had kept it carefully in the notebook. He had kept carefully in the chest. He had kept carefully, and she had found it at exactly the moment when she needed to find it, and not a moment before. She thought about Ezra Whitlock and his piece of paper. Don't forget the moisture. He had looked at her trench, and he had known not the specifics perhaps, but the category of error, the thing that underground experience teaches, that surface experience doesn't. He had not explained it to her. He had given her the words and trusted her to arrive at the understanding when the understanding was needed. Both of them had given her what she needed in a form she could not immediately use and had to carry until she was ready. She sat in the tunnel and understood this, and then she stood up and went back to work. The third day arrived with a sky that had changed color. It was no longer the pale, ambiguous gray of a November morning that might resolve into something bearable. It was the specific weighted gray of a sky with intentions, a sky that had made a decision. The wind was no longer variable. It was coming from the northwest with the steady, committed pressure of something that had a destination and was not interested in detours. Clara came up from the tunnel at first light, refilled the lantern, and stood in the yard for a moment assessing the sky. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight. The grass was not merely frosted but stiff, each blade encased immobile. The yard transformed from an organic surface into something more like a mineral one. In the far distance along the ridge line to the northwest, she could see the leading edge of what was coming. A darkness that was not cloud in the ordinary sense, but a density, a thickness of atmosphere that meant snow was already falling there, that what was coming was not a flurry or a squall, but a system, a committed meteorological event with resources and patience. She had perhaps 6 hours, maybe 8. The drainage outlet at the barn end was not yet cut. She went back down. The outlet required piercing the barn foundation, a wall of rough-cut stone and mortar that Henrik had built with the thoroughness he brought to structural work, which meant it was solid and was not going to yield graciously. She used the heaviest end of the iron bar as a chisel, working at the mortar joints, finding the line of least resistance and following it. The barn was cold. Her breath made clouds. Nell watched her from the stall with the patient attention of an animal that has decided to trust the human in the room, despite the unusual nature of her current activity. The mortar came away in fragments. The stone shifted. She worked the iron bar deeper, levering, and a section of the foundation gave way, not collapsed but opened, creating a gap 4 inches wide at the base of the wall. She shaped it with the narrow shovel, angled it downward into the earth below the foundation, line below the frost line, into the stable ground where temperature was memory and not event. She stood back, looked at the outlet, looked at the drainage channel running back through the tunnel to the cabin end. She took a bucket of water from the trough and poured it slowly into the drainage channel at the cabin end. She watched. The water moved. Slowly following the angle she had cut into the floor, it traveled the length of the channel past the first junction point, past the midpoint, where the tunnel was deepest, past the second junction, all the way to the barn end, and disappeared through the outlet into the earth below. It worked. She stood in the cold barn with the iron bar in her hand and the bucket at her feet, and the water gone into the ground where it belonged, and she felt something that was not triumph. Triumph was for people who had been certain they would succeed. What she felt was closer to relief, and underneath the relief, something quieter and more durable. She had found the flaw and addressed it. She had read Henrik's failure and turned it into her own instruction. She had taken a trap and made it safe. The wind struck the barn wall with a sound like a flat hand on a drum. She looked up at the barn roof. The sky was visible through a gap in the boards near the peak she had been meaning to address, that gap since August, and had not gotten to it, and what she could see of the sky through it had gone the color of iron. She gathered her tools and went back through the tunnel to the cabin. Callum was at the table with his drawing things. He had a piece of brown paper, the same kind he had used for the tunnel drawing in August, and he was working on it with the focused intensity he brought to everything he made. She looked at it as she passed. He was drawing the homestead from above the way a bird would see it, the cabin and the barn, and between them the long, low mound of the tunnel visible from the air as a slight ridge in the earth. But he had added something. Running from the tunnel mound in multiple directions were other lines, other passages connecting to other structures she did not recognize, structures that did not exist on their property, structures that were perhaps neighboring homesteads, perhaps imagined ones. She looked at the drawing and thought of Henrik's words on the last page of the notebook. Warmth should not be a private victory. It should be a shared one. She did not say anything about the drawing. She went to the stove and built up the fire and started a pot of oatmeal and looked out the window at the sky. The storm arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way serious Montana weather always arrived, with the abruptness of a decision already made, a condition already established somewhere else and now relocated here. One moment the yard was visible, the light flat and gray, but present. The next moment the yard was not visible. There was simply white, not falling snow, but flying snow that was horizontal, snow that was moving at 40 miles an hour and had no intention of slowing down. The temperature, which had been cold all day, dropped 30 degrees in the first hour. She could feel it through the cabin walls as a change in pressure, as a new quality of assault against the timber and chinking. The stove was burning. The single flame in the oil lamp on the table burned straight and vertical. There were no drafts. The tunnel's connection to the root cellar, which she had sealed carefully at both ends with heavy doors, meant that the cold air had no easy entry point. The cabin was not warm in the way of a well-built house with a large fireplace and a generous wood supply. It was warm in the way of a sealed space with a small but consistent heat source and no leaks, a warmth that was uniform that lived in the air throughout the room rather than in a hot zone near the stove and a cold zone at the walls. Callum sat on the floor and played with his wooden soldiers, the ones Henrik had carved for him. He arranged them in formations that had a strategic logic she could not always follow, moved them in sequences that represented narratives she was not always given access to. He was absorbed. He was not afraid. She was grateful for both. She went to the tunnel at 4 o'clock to tend the animals. She put on her shawl, not her coat, her shawl. She opened the root cellar door and descended and opened the tunnel door and walked the 100 feet through the still lantern-lit passage and emerged in the barn into the sound of 3 animals breathing and the smell of straw and manure and warm biology, which was in this context the smell of everything going correctly. Nell's water trough had a skim of ice thin easily broken with the heel of her hand, not the solid block she had spent the previous winter hacking at with an axe in the pre-dawn dark. She broke it, drew the fresh water up from the supplies she kept in sealed containers in the tunnel, where the temperature kept it liquid, refilled the trough. She checked the goats, she checked the chickens. She gave Nell the warm mash she prepared each evening from the grain she kept stored at the tunnel's midpoint, another use she had found for the passage that Henrik's design had not specified. She was in the barn for 20 minutes. She returned to the cabin with a pail of fresh milk that Nell had provided with her usual reliability, and she heated some of it for Callum on the stove, and they ate their dinner together in the still warm air of the cabin, while outside the storm conducted its siege against everything it could reach. "Is it bad?" Callum asked. He was looking at the window, which showed nothing but white moving white. "Yes," she said. There was no point in softening it. He was 6 years old, but he was not simple. "Are we safe?" She looked at him across the table. "Yes," she said. "We are safe." He nodded and went back to his food with the trust of a child who has been told the truth often enough to believe it when it comes. She did not sleep much that first night. She kept the stove at a low burn, one small log every 2 hours, the same rhythm she had established in early November when the tunnel system was first operational. She went to the tunnel twice in the night, checking the drainage, running her hand along the stone walls to assess the moisture. The walls were cool and faintly damp, as they had been before she cut the drainage channels. But the dampness was not accumulating. The channels were working. The moisture that the animals produced was finding its way out of the system rather than building up against the stone. She stood in the tunnel at 2 in the morning with the lantern in her hand on the wall, and she thought, "Henrik, it works. Your idea works. We fixed your mistake, and it works." She was not a woman given to talking to the dead. But there was something in the tunnel, in its stillness, in the weight of the earth above her, in the stone around her, that made the words feel less like the words you say to someone who is gone, and more like the words you say to someone who is very far away, but still present, still listening, still invested in the outcome of the experiment. The second day of the storm was worse than the first. The wind increased. The snow had accumulated to the point where the drifts against the north and west walls of the cabin were visible above the window line, a white pressure that gave the cabin the quality of a vessel submerged, surrounded on all sides by a medium that was not its own. The light that came through the windows was filtered and the light of depth rather than surface. Clara maintained her rhythm. Stove, tunnel, animals, stove. She was using by her calculation roughly a third of the wood she had burned through the same duration in the previous winter's worst storm. The tunnel system was not providing warmth. It was preventing the loss of warmth, which was, as Henrik had understood, the more important function. You did not need to generate more heat than you lost. You needed to stop losing more heat than you could generate. The distinction was the entire argument. Callum adapted to the confinement with a pragmatic acceptance that she recognized as characteristic. He drew. He played with his soldiers. He asked occasional questions that she answered honestly. He slept when he was tired and woke when he wasn't. He did not complain about the size of the space or the absence of outside air or the relentlessness of the storm. He was his father's son in this too. Henrik had never complained about the mines, about the darkness and the confinement, about the work that required descending into the earth and trusting it to hold. He had understood something that most people needed to learn the hard way, if they learned it at all, that the earth was not hostile. It was indifferent. And indifference properly engaged was something you could work with. On the second night, she heard something she was not expecting. She was sitting at the table by lamplight, working on the English translation of a particularly dense section of Henrik's seventh notebook. She had been continuing this project in the evenings, working through his ideas, systematically building her understanding of the physics behind what she had built, when she heard from the direction of the root cellar a sound that was not the storm. The storm was a constant, a presence without specific events, a sustained roar that was so consistent she had learned to filter it. What she heard now had a different quality, a rhythm, a pattern. She picked up the lantern and went to the root cellar door and opened it and listened. From the far end of the tunnel, from the barn end, she could hear, muffled by the distance, and the earth above, something that resolved as she listened more carefully into the unmistakable percussion of a hand against wood. Someone was knocking on the barn door from the inside. She stood at the top of the cellar stairs and worked through what this could mean. Her animals were in the barn. An animal could not knock on a door. Someone was in her barn who had not come through her cabin. Someone had found their way into her barn through the exterior door, the large rolling door on the south face of the building that was in ordinary weather the primary entrance. She went down the cellar stairs, through the tunnel door, and along the passage with the lantern held ahead of her. At the barn end, she opened the tunnel door and stepped into the barn. Two figures were standing in the middle of the barn floor. They were covered in snow to a degree that made them barely distinguishable as human. They were more like formations, snow creatures, the kind a child might imagine in a story. They were also small. She held the lantern up. A boy, perhaps 9 years old, and a girl smaller, perhaps 7. The boy had dark hair when she could see it beneath the packed snow, and eyes that were very wide and very dark, and that held in them the specific expression that comes after the fear has used itself up, and what remains is something raw and harder to name. The girl was holding his hand. She was not crying, which Clara understood meant that she had been crying for a long time and had stopped because the body had exhausted that particular resource. Clara had seen them before. Birch Dunmore, Willa Dunmore, Garrett and Prudence's children from the mill property on the north edge of town. The children of the man who had called her project a folly. She crossed the barn floor to them and knelt so that her eyes were level with theirs, and she looked at them for a moment without speaking. Assessing, they were cold, very cold. But they were moving, both of them, and their eyes were tracking, which meant the cold had not yet done the serious work it was capable of doing. "Can you walk?" she asked. The boy nodded. "Good. Follow me." She led them through the tunnel. They came without hesitation, which told her something about the severity of what they had endured outside. The tunnel, with its cool, steady air and its absolute stillness, must have seemed to them like a different world, like something from the inside of a story about underground warmth, rather than a real passage beneath a real yard in a real storm. The girl made a small sound when they entered it, not a word, not a cry, something between the two, a sound that acknowledged a change in conditions. Clara brought them to the cabin. She sat them close to the stove, not touching it close enough for warmth, not close enough for the shock of sudden heat. She stripped off their outermost layers, which were soaked through, and wrapped them in the wool blankets she kept folded at the foot of her bed. She put water on to heat and went to the root cellar for the dried venison and the preserves. Callum watched all of this from his corner of the room with the attentive stillness of a child who understands he is witnessing something important and has decided that questions can wait. The girl Willa stopped shaking first. The boy Birch held on longer, the shaking working through him in waves, his jaw tight, his hands clenched around the edge of the blanket. Clara did not try to stop the shaking. The shaking was the body's own intelligence, the mechanism by which it generated heat. She let it work, and she held a cup of warm broth in her hands and waited until the shaking was regular enough that he could hold the cup without spilling it. They had been walking since midday, she learned. They had been at a friend's home, the Alderson place, a mile east when the storm came down, and they had decided to leave before they understood what was coming. And by the time they understood what was coming, they were already in it and finding their way in. It was a matter of moving against the wind, because east to west meant home, and home was where they were going, and they had been going west in the white for 3 hours before the barn appeared in front of them by accident or by luck or by whatever it is that puts a structure in front of two children who need a structure. The tunnel Clara thought had saved them too, though not in the way she had designed it. The barn itself had saved them. The barn that the tunnel served, the barn that was warm enough to sustain 3 animals and 2 children through the worst night of the year. She gave them food. She gave them a place to sleep on the floor near the stove, on the quilt she laid down for them. Willa fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing slow and even in the particular depth of exhaustion. Birch stayed awake longer, watching the room with those dark eyes that had seen too much that day for sleep to come easily. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Yes." "My father said your tunnel was—" He stopped. She waited. "He was wrong," Birch said. She looked at this 9-year-old boy who had walked 3 hours through a killing storm and arrived in her barn through a door her tunnel kept warm enough to function, and she thought about his father's cheerful certainty, his confident dismissal, the public consensus he had helped to build and name. "Your father is a good man," she said. "He said what he believed. Most people do." Birch considered this. Then he pulled the quilt tighter around himself and lay down on the floor beside his sister and closed his eyes. Clara sat at the table with her lamp and her notebook and listened to the storm and the breathing of the children and the faint regular sounds from the tunnel, the slight movement of air that was the system working the geothermal engine Henrik had designed and she had built, and Ezra Whitlock had given her the last piece of the passive mechanism that had no moving parts and required no tending and simply continued to function, because the earth remembered what it had been taught by 100,000 summers. She did not think about Harlan Stroud. She did not think about what he might be experiencing in his large, well-built house with its great stone fireplace 150 feet from his barn in this storm. She would think about that tomorrow when the storm gave her something to think about it with. She opened Henrik's notebook and read until the lamp needed refilling, and then she refilled it and read some more. And somewhere in the deepest part of the night, the wind outside began almost imperceptibly to change its tone. The wind died at dawn on the 4th day. It did not taper. It did not diminish gradually the way storms sometimes do, giving you time to adjust to the idea of their ending. It simply stopped the way a held breath stops when the lungs finally surrender, and the silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that Clara woke from the shallow sleep she had finally allowed herself and lay still for a moment, uncertain what had changed, knowing only that something had. Then she understood. The absence of sound was the sound of the storm being over. She rose without waking the children and went to the window. The glass was frosted on the inside, a lacework of crystals that obscured the view. She breathed on a small section until it cleared and pressed her face close and looked out at the world. It was unrecognizable. The yard, which she knew the way she knew the lines of her own hands, had been replaced by a landscape of white geometry, drifts sculpted by the wind into shapes that bore no relationship to the contours of the land beneath them. The barn was visible barely as a dark rectangle half buried in white, its roof line the only horizontal she could identify with certainty. The tunnel mound between the cabin and the barn was invisible, subsumed entirely by the drifts erased. The fence posts that marked the property boundary had been reduced to small dark points emerging from the white like punctuation in a sentence written in a language she was still learning. The sky above all of it was the color of raw bone, pale bright, carrying in it the particular quality of light that follows a major storm, a light that is almost painful in its clarity after days of obscured gray. The sun was not yet fully up, but its approach was announced by a luminosity at the eastern edge of the sky that had the quality of something important arriving. Clara stood at the frosted window for a moment. Then she put on her coat and her boots and began to prepare for what the day would require. The children woke while she was at the stove. Willa first she surfaced from sleep quickly and completely, the way young children do, one moment absent and the next entirely present, sitting up on the quilt and looking around the cabin with the alert, assessing gaze of someone who needed only a few seconds to reconstruct where she was and why. Birch came up more slowly, dragged from whatever depth the previous day's ordeal had sent him to, blinking in the lamplight with the careful movements of a body that was checking its own condition before committing to wakefulness. Clara gave them both oatmeal. She gave Callum oatmeal. She ate herself, standing at the stove watching the light outside strengthen through the cleared section of the window. "The storm stopped," Birch said. "Yes. We have to go home." "Not yet. The drifts are deep. We need to clear a path first." She looked at him. "Your parents know you're safe." He looked back at her. How? She had not in fact been able to inform anyone of anything. The storm had been complete in its isolation. But she said what she believed to be true. "Your parents are practical people. They will have thought about where you might have gone. They will have thought about the nearest shelter from the direction you were traveling." She paused. "They will have thought of the barn." Whether this was true, she could not know. But Birch needed something to carry for the next few hours while she cleared the path, and it was the most honest version of comfort she could offer. After breakfast, she went to the tunnel. Alone, this time without the lantern, the light through the barn's high-gap boards was sufficient now that the storm had passed. She walked the length of the passage, slowly running her hand along each wall in sequence checking. The stone was cool, uniformly correctly cool, damp in places as it would always be damp where warm animal air met cool stone. But the dampness was a surface condition, not a building one. The drainage channels were doing their work. The moisture that the animals produced was finding its way out and down into the stable earth exactly as she had designed, exactly as Ezra Whitlock's note had guided her toward. The walls were not icing. The passage was not contracting. The temperature throughout the tunnel was, by the estimate of her palm and her accumulated experience of it, somewhere between 48 and 52 degrees. Henrik's number. The Earth's number. The number that meant survivable. She stood in the middle of the tunnel and breathed. The air moved faintly against her face, the slight passive circulation of the system driven by no mechanism other than the differential between the barn's warmth and the tunnel's cool. The slow breath of a machine with no moving parts. She had stood in this tunnel in August and imagined it. She had stood in it in November and believed it. She was standing in it now in the aftermath of the worst storm the valley had seen in years, and it had worked exactly as the physics said. It would work exactly as a dead man's notebook said. It would work exactly as she had known it would work at 3 in the morning on the second night when she had said, "Henrik, it works to the stone wall in the patient dark." She went back to the cabin and picked up the snow shovel. The work of clearing the path took 2 hours. The drifts against the cabin's north face were shoulder height, compressed by the wind into a density that was closer to ice than snow, and that the shovel struck with a solid resistance. She worked methodically, cutting sections away, rather than attempting to move the mass wholesale, creating a passage through rather than over. Callum and Birch followed behind her, pushing the cut sections aside with a second smaller shovel she had given Birch, and with their booted feet. Willa walked in the cleared path behind them, which was the most useful thing a 7-year-old could do in these conditions. The 100 feet to the barn took 40 minutes to clear. She opened the barn door. The animals regarded her arrival with the equanimity of creatures whose immediate needs had been consistently met and who had no complaint about their current situation. Nell had milk waiting. The goats had opinions about the lateness of the morning feeding that they expressed in their customary way. The chickens were roosting and would need to be encouraged into activity, which was also their customary condition. She did the chores with the children watching from the doorway, and when she was done, she looked back through the open barn door at the path she had cleared and thought, this is the first morning of what comes after. She heard the horse before she saw it. The sound came from the direction of the main road, a labored rhythmic compression of snow, the sound of a large animal moving through drifts that were too deep for easy passage, moving anyway because it had been asked to. She came out of the barn and stood in the path she had cleared and looked toward the road. Harlan Stroud was coming across the field. He was on his gray horse, the large one he kept for ranch work. The horse was moving through drifts that came to its chest, in places lunging through rather than stepping, and Stroud was sitting it with the practiced balance of a man who had been on horseback in difficult conditions for 40 years. He was bundled in heavy wool, a scarf across the lower part of his face, his hat pulled low. He was moving with purpose. Clara did not go to meet him. She stood in her cleared path between the cabin and the barn and watched him come. He reached the edge of her property and pulled the horse to a stop. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the thin curl of smoke from the chimney. He looked at the cleared path. He looked at her standing in the path with her snow shovel in her hands. His expression was not legible at this distance. He dismounted. He tied the horse to the fence post and came through the gate and walked toward her through the uncleared snow on the sides of the path. The snow came to his thighs. He moved through it with a kind of deliberate, effortful dignity, a large man in difficult terrain, unwilling to let the difficulty show in his posture, even when it showed clearly in his pace. He stopped 5 feet from her. She could see his face now. She had expected perhaps the controlled expression of a man who had come to deliver some version of reluctant acknowledgement, the face of someone prepared to concede a point on strict terms. That was not what she saw. What she saw was the face of a man who had been broken. Not recently, not this morning, not in the storm. Before the storm. A year before the storm, perhaps longer, the breaking had begun and the storm had completed it, and what was left was something that had the shape of Harlan Stroud, but had lost the structural certainty that had made him recognizable as himself. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the tunnel mound buried under snow, invisible as a mound, but the outline of it still legible to someone looking for it, a slight linear regularity in the drifts that gave away the organized thing beneath. He looked at her. 3, he said. His voice was not loud. The cold and the silence after the storm made it carry anyway. She waited. 3 head dead. The others, he stopped. Worked something in his jaw. The others are sick. The water froze solid, twice. He paused again. I couldn't reach the barn. Second day. Wind took me sideways before I was halfway there. I had to come back. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be either insufficient or unkind, and she did not want to be unkind to this man today. She had not wanted to be unkind to him in September when he rode to her property and told her she was digging her grave. She had simply been unable to explain what she knew in terms he was able to receive. That had not been his fault or her fault. It was the fault of the distance between what a person knows and what they can communicate to someone who has not yet needed to know it. He looked at the barn door open behind her. How, he said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the word that sits between them in the place where understanding is trying to form. She stepped aside and gestured toward the barn. He came through the path she had cleared. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at the interior, at the animals alive and standing at the water trough with its thin breakable ice, at the straw bedding dry and undisturbed, at the general atmosphere of a space that had endured the storm without losing the basic conditions that life required. He stood there for a long time. Then he saw the children. Birch and Willow were standing near Nell's stall, where Birch had been showing his sister how to offer an open palm to the cow for investigation. He had discovered this activity 20 minutes earlier and had been absorbed in it since. He looked up when Stroud appeared in the doorway. Stroud looked at the Dunmore children for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. She offered no explanation. The explanation was obvious, and she suspected he could construct it himself. He turned back to the barn interior. He walked slowly along the length of it, looking at everything: the sealed joints she had chinked in October, the extra insulation she had packed between the lower boards, the tunnel door set flush with the foundation wall. He stopped at the tunnel door and looked at it for a long time. "Show me," he said. His voice was different from the voice he had used in September, when he had sat on his horse and told her she was engaged in a great folly. That voice had been a voice for delivering verdicts. This voice was something else. It was the voice of a man who has lost a son and 3 cattle, and the certainty that his own methods were sufficient, and who is standing in front of evidence that a different method exists, and who is finally ready to understand it. She took the lantern from the hook inside the barn door. She opened the tunnel door and held the lantern through and let the light show him what was on the other side. He stepped through without hesitation. They walked the tunnel together, she with the lantern, he with his hands, occasionally touching the walls, the stone. He ran his bare fingers across, feeling the temperature, comparing it with some internal reference. She could see him making the calculation in real time, the comparison between what his body told him this stone felt like and what the stone outside would feel like. The differential that was the whole argument. At the midpoint of the tunnel, he stopped. He stood there in the still air, with the lantern light moving on the walls, and he put both hands flat against the stone on either side, the way a man might stop in a doorway to feel what lies on the other side of it. His eyes were closed. She waited. 50 degrees, he said, give or take. Yes. All winter. Yes. He opened his eyes and looked at the tunnel ahead of them, at the distant square of barn light at the Perwen. He looked at the drainage channels she had cut along the bases of the walls. He looked at the ceiling timbers and the careful joinery where the stones met them. Your husband designed this. He designed it. I built it. He looked at her in the lantern light. You built this. With Callum's help. Something moved through his face. Not the broken thing she had seen outside, something older than that. Something that lived behind the certainty and the authority and the grief. Something that recognized what it was looking at. My fireplace, he said. It was the beginning of a sentence that he did not seem to know how to finish. Is a very efficient machine, she said, for warming the air above your chimney. It works very hard. It just works in the wrong direction. He was silent for a moment. Henrik understood this. He understood it in a mine in Pennsylvania. He wrote about it for 20 years. He was going to build this before she stopped. Before the mine. Yes. Stroud looked at the tunnel floor. He looked at the drainage channel. He looked at the outlet she had cut in the barn foundation wall, the small gap through which the moisture left the system and returned to the stable earth. The moisture, he said, that's the piece you have to get right. She looked at him. Yes, how did you know? I've been in mine shafts. I've seen what moisture does to stone when it has nowhere to go. He touched the drainage channel with one boot. This is why it works. The moisture has an exit. She thought of Ezra Whitlock's piece of paper. The old man in his cabin at the edge of the valley, 30 years of underground knowledge, written in the compressed script of someone accustomed to small spaces. Don't forget the moisture. A man named Ezra Whitlock, she said. He left me a note in September. Stroud looked at her. Whitlock, old man, lives out past the Alderson property. Yes. I know him, or knew him. Haven't seen him since... He paused. Since fall. She nodded. She would learn what this meant later. For now, she led Stroud back through the tunnel to the cabin, through the root cellar up into the warmth. The children looked up when they emerged. Stroud saw Birch and Willa again, and something in his expression softened briefly before reassembling itself. Your father will be looking for you, he said to Birch. I know, sir. I'll take you home, when Mrs. Voss says it's safe to travel. Birch looked at Clara. Another hour, she said. The horse needs rest. She put water on to boil. She went to the wooden chest beneath her bed and took out Henrik's 7th notebook, the last one, the one with the folded page she had read in November, and the pages that came after it, the pages she had been working through in the evenings during the storm. She set it on the table. Stroud sat across from her. He wrapped both hands around the cup she gave him and looked at the notebook without touching it, the way a man looks at something that belongs to someone else and that he wants to understand but knows he must be invited to approach. She opened it to the last entry Henrik had made. The handwriting was the same small, precise, the compressed script of an engineer who considered every word a form of measurement, but there was something in the quality of the ink, the pressure of the pen, that was different from the earlier entries. Lighter, as though he had been tired when he wrote it, or careful, or both. She read it herself first silently, the German running through her mind and assembling itself into English in the way it had learned to do over the months she had spent with these notebooks. Then she read it to Stroud, in English, slowly, the way you read something that is meant to carry more weight than ordinary language. The entry was undated. It was the last thing Henrik had written, she believed, before the mine. She had no way to be certain. But the quality of it, the way it arrived without preamble as a conclusion rather than an observation, suggested it had been written by a man who was arriving at the end of something. He wrote about the tunnel. He wrote about the principle, the Earth's thermal memory, the stable temperature below the frost line, the passive system that required no fuel and no tending. He wrote about the failure in Saxony and what it had taught him. He wrote about the drainage, the moisture, the piece he had gotten wrong and understood too late to correct in that first attempt. And then he wrote, this is not a thing for one family. I have been thinking of it as a private solution, a thing we will build for ourselves, and that will make our winters easier and our animals safer and our son less afraid of the cold. But I was wrong about that. The principle is simple enough that anyone can understand it. The labor is significant, but not beyond what a community might accomplish together if they understood what they were working toward. I want to write it down clearly enough that someone else could build it. I want to write it down clearly enough that it could survive me if it needed to. She paused. Stroud was looking at the notebook. His cup sat untouched. She continued, warmth should not be a private victory. There is no honor in being the only warm house in a valley of frozen ones. If this works, and I believe it will work, I believe the physics is correct, and the implementation is achievable, then it should become a shared thing. A community of connected spaces, houses and barns and workshops and whatever else people need linked underground, each one contributing its heat to the whole, each one drawing stability from the earth that holds them all. The earth doesn't know property lines. It holds the same temperature beneath the Voss claim and the Stroud claim and the Dunmore claim and every other claim in the valley. That temperature is available to all of them equally. Die Erde vergisst den Sommer nicht. The earth does not forget the summer. Neither should we. She closed the notebook. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the sky was fully light now, the brilliant, painful blue of a Montana morning. After a storm, the sky so clear, it seemed to have been scrubbed, every particle of cloud and obscurity removed by 3 days of violent weather. The sun was climbing, and the light it threw through the cleared section of the window fell across the table in a rectangle of pale gold that moved slowly as it always moved, marking the passage of time, with the only instrument that had been keeping time in this cabin since before anyone who lived here was born. Stroud looked at the notebook for a long time after she stopped reading. He looked at it the way you look at something that has said something to you that you were not expecting to hear, that has arrived at a conclusion you had not known you were approaching. He looked up at her. Teach me, he said. It was the same word he had said into the tunnel. But the tunnel version had been a request made by a man who had been broken and was beginning in the most preliminary way to think about what rebuilding might look like. This version was something more considered. He had sat with the notebook and the cup of warm water and the rectangle of morning light and the knowledge of 3 dead cattle and Daniel's absence and 15 years of a method that had worked until it didn't, and he had arrived at a word that was not for him easy. She understood this. She pulled the notebook toward herself and opened it to the first diagram, the cross-section drawing, the one that showed the tunnel in relation to the cabin and the barn with Henrik's careful arrows indicating airflow and his neat temperature notations in the margins. She turned it so that Stroud could see it. She began to explain. She explained the frost line, the depth below which the seasonal temperature change could not reach the point at which the Earth's memory of all the accumulated summers outweighed the winter's insistence. She explained the thermal mass, the stone walls that absorbed and stored and released heat, with the patient indifference of material that had been doing this for longer than anyone could measure. She explained the convection, the slow, unpowered movement of air driven by differential temperature, the warm breath of the animals rising, cooling against the stone, sinking, traveling the system, breathing without lungs. She explained the moisture. She explained Saxony. She explained Ezra Whitlock's note and what it had meant and how she had understood it only when understanding it was almost too late. She explained the drainage channels, the outlet into the subfrost earth, the way moisture had to have an exit, or it became the enemy of everything you were trying to build. Stroud listened with the concentrated attention of a man who had been managing a large operation for 20 years, and who understood systems, who knew how to hear a description of something physical and construct the reality of it in his mind from the description alone. He asked 3 questions. Each question was precise and indicated that he had understood everything up to the point of the question and needed only the next piece. She answered each one. When she was finished, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table looking at the diagram. Spring, he said. Yes. I'll start in the spring, when the ground is workable. The stone is the important thing. Flat stones dry stacked. No mortar cracks in the freeze-thaw cycle, and the wall loses integrity. I know dry stack. I built the spring house that way. And the drainage. Every 15 feet angled down outlet below the frost line. The Whitlock note. Yes, he looked at her. Will you advise? While we build. She considered this. It was not a small thing he was asking. It was the acknowledgement by the most powerful man in the valley that the woman he had publicly dismissed 8 months ago had knowledge he needed. He was asking her to be present for the construction, not as a curiosity or a subject of the community's complicated attention, but as a technical authority. He was asking her in the precise practical language of a man who did not waste words on sentiment to be the person who knew what she knew. Yes, she said. He nodded. He picked up his cup and drank the water, which had gone cold. He set the cup down and stood. The children, he said. Birch, Clara called. The boy appeared from the corner of the cabin where he and Callum had been sitting together on the floor, Birch showing Callum something with his hands, some game or story, or the kind of collaborative silence that children create when they have been through something together and are not yet ready to talk about it, but need proximity. They both looked up. Time to go home, Clara said. Birch stood. He looked at Stroud, assessed him with the frank directness of a child who had decided that certain social conventions were temporarily suspended, and then looked at Clara. Thank you, he said. The words came out with the deliberate weight of someone who had been raised to understand that some debts were real and that acknowledging them was not optional. Tell your father to come see me in the spring, she said, when the ground is workable. Birch nodded. He went to get Willa. Stroud left with the children, the horse picking its careful way through the drifts, Birch and Willa riding behind Stroud on the horse's wide back. Willa's arms around her brother's waist, her face tucked against his shoulder. Clara watched them go from the cabin doorway until the horse and its passengers were small against the white field, and then until they were gone. She went inside and sat at the table with Henrik's notebook open in front of her. She turned to the last entry again and read the final lines. She had read them many times now in the evenings during the storm, the words running through her mind while the wind conducted its argument with the world outside. But they arrived differently this morning in the stillness after the storm, with the rectangle of morning light crossing the table and the sound of Callum and Stroud's departing horse fading into the brilliant quiet. The earth doesn't know property lines. It holds the same temperature beneath all of them. She thought about Ezra Whitlock. She thought about the note he had left her, the 30 years of underground knowledge compressed into 3 lines on a piece of paper tucked into a fence post. She thought about the way he had stood at the edge of her trench and said Pennsylvania bituminous seam. 40 feet down, 52 degrees. She had not known then what she was receiving. She had known it was important. She had kept it because she understood without being able to articulate why, that it was a transmission from a kind of knowledge she needed. She would go to his cabin when the paths were clear. She would thank him in person for the note and for the words he had said at her trench, and for the fact of his presence on that September morning, the one person in the valley who had stood at the edge of her work and not laughed. She would learn when she went that Ezra Whitlock had died quietly in his cabin in December before the storm. The neighbor who had checked on him in early January had found him at his table with his notebooks open, 30 years of underground temperature readings and moisture observations and airflow measurements. The accumulated record of a man who had spent his working life in the earth and had written everything down because he understood that knowledge left in a single body is knowledge at risk. On the cover of the last notebook in the handwriting she had seen on the fence post note, he had written 4 words for whoever needs this. He had not known it would be her. He had not needed to know. He had simply understood that the knowledge he carried had a future beyond him and had arranged for the transfer. She would bring the notebooks home. She would add them to the chest with Henrik's. She would spend the following winter reading through them, translating the practical underground knowledge of a Pennsylvania coal miner into the language of Montana homesteading, finding, in his observations, the confirmation and the extension of everything Henrik had theorized. 2 men who had never met, who had come to the same understanding from different directions, who had left their knowledge in forms that could survive them. And 1 woman in Montana who had needed both of them. But that was later. On this morning, on the first morning of what came after, she sat at the table with Henrik's notebook in the morning light and Callum's quiet presence at her side, and she allowed herself for a few minutes to simply be still. Callum had his drawing things. He was working on the overhead view of the valley again, the one she had seen during the storm with the tunnel lines running between structures in multiple directions. He had added more lines since then, more structures, the drawing growing outward from the center, in a pattern that was not random, but organized, that had the quality of something being planned rather than imagined. She watched him draw. She watched his small, careful hand move across the paper, laying down the lines of a future he was too young to build, but not too young to envision. She thought of what Henrik had written. a community of connected spaces, each one contributing its heat to the whole. She thought of Stroud's voice in the tunnel, "Teach me," and the spring morning somewhere in the future when she would stand in his yard and help him mark the line with stakes and twine the line that would run from his house to his barn, the same 100-foot distance that had killed his son, now navigable because the earth beneath it offered a passage the winter could not reach. She thought of Garrett at Dunmore, who would come to her door in April with his hat in his hands and ask to see what she had built, because his wife had told him what his children had found in her barn, and because a man who has built his certainty on a public position and has then watched that position fail, the children of his own household, is a man who is ready to learn something different. He would not apologize in so many words. He would arrive with labor instead, 3 days of digging, his broad shoulders bent to the work, obey without complaint, as if hard work were the only language he knew for acknowledging that he had been wrong about something. She thought of the spring that was coming, of the ground thawing and becoming workable, of the stakes and the twine and the first shovelful of earth turned in a new line between a new set of buildings. She thought of the valley in 5 years and 10, the low mounds running between properties, the network of connected warmth that Henrik had imagined in the last entry of his last notebook, the thing he had not lived to build. She thought of all of this, and then she stopped thinking about it, and she was simply here at this table on this morning, with her son, drawing the future and the notebook open in front of her, and the warmth of the earth holding steady beneath them, at 52 degrees, exactly as it had been holding all winter, exactly as it would hold all summer, exactly as it would be holding long after everyone who had ever argued about the tunnel was gone and the tunnel itself had become simply the way things were done in this valley. The obvious and unremarkable method of connecting the places where people lived to the places their animals lived, the sensible arrangement that required you to trust nothing more complicated than the earth's own memory. Henrik had written, "We must not fight the cold. We must bargain with the heat that is already there." She closed the notebook. She laid her palm flat against its cover for a moment, feeling the worn leather, the slight ridge where the spine had been repaired with a strip of rawhide sometime before she knew him. She had spent a year learning to read this book. She had spent a year learning to read the winter and the earth and the distance between what a person knows and what they are ready to know. She was 34 years old. She had a tunnel and a barn and a son who drew the future in cross-section on pieces of brown paper. She had enough wood and enough food and enough animals to carry them through to spring. She had the notebooks of two men who had trusted that their knowledge would find its way to whoever needed it. Outside, the Montana sky was the impossible blue of the day after a storm, the blue that exists only in the absence of everything that had been obscuring it. The sun was climbing. The snow on the tunnel mound was beginning in the direct sunlight to show the first faint suggestion of crystalline water at its surface, not melting, not yet, but remembering that it had been something else before it was snow and would be something else again. Clara Voss put on her coat and her boots. She picked up her shovel. She went outside to clear the paths. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That was not a complaint. It was the other side of the only bargain the land offered, the one where endurance was the currency, and the earth, if you listened to it carefully enough, told you what it already held. She listened. She drove the shovel into the snow.